We see these godly men in the Bible, like Moses and Lot, using women as objects.
They most certainly do, but don't confuse descriptions in the Bible with prescriptions.
Okay, I won't. Let's just talk about the times where God prescribed these morally repugnant behaviors. We won't talk about all the times where these actions are simply described. I'm with you, IP. First, let's talk about Abraham. In fact, what I'm going to do today, and by the way, I'm Brandon, this is Mindshift, this is a Tuesday Takedown, not of IP, but just of the arguments themselves. And this is an argument that is all too common. Someone like myself points out something that happened in the Old Testament or even the New Testament that is morally and obviously wrong. And then an apologist or a Christian says these were broken, fallen men. God worked through them. Look at all the times God punished them for that wrong behavior. But I want to look at today the times that God did not punish them, which could be its own category. God staying out of it while essentially still allowing it. But we'll go further. Let's go straight to the times that God prescribes morally bad behavior. We're going to look at 10 patriarchs or leading men in the Old Testament for this exercise. We'll save the New Testament for another time, but I want to kind of major in the majors that they're talking about in this video.
Just because the Bible narrates the sin of the patriarchs and prophets, that doesn't mean it endorses their behavior.
So, getting back to Abraham, God specifically tells Abraham to agree with his wife Sarah and exile Hagar and her son Ishmael from Abraham's household and protection. And I want to give you the full context of the story so that we can really draw out some of these examples. So first, Abraham and Sarah cannot conceive. And Sarah, who owns a foreign slave, not indentured servitude, this is an Egyptian slave, Hagar, as property, which by the way, in all the things that God condemns, he never condemns this. This is something he specifically endorses in Leviticus 25:44 through 46. Sarah can do whatever she wants with this piece of property, and so she has Abraham have sex with her. She uses Hagar as a surrogate. We, of course, don't hear about Hagar's consent because why would we? And we do know that during the pregnancy, Hagar is mistreated by Sarah to the point that she wants to flee, and she does. She leaves into the wilderness, where she is tracked down by an angel from God, by the way, talking about prescriptions here, and tells her to go back and submit to Sarah, despite her mistreatment. Because unlike those indentured servants, there are no laws to protect the foreigners. So she goes back and has her child, Ishmael, but then Sarah has Isaac. And one day, Sarah sees Isaac and Ishmael playing together, and she does not like this. So she tells Abraham, have Hagar and Ishmael removed, exile them. And even Abraham's not sure about this. He's like, but that's my son. Again, who cares about Hagar? She's just a woman, a piece of property. And God himself, let me read it to you, in Genesis 21:10 through 13. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah is telling you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. There's so many things happening here. First of all, you have God 100% endorsing exile them, split up this family. These brothers cause division, which we don't have time in today's video to talk about the implications of that and how we're still feeling those ramifications, which God with his foreknowledge would have known. But notice he refers to Hagar twice in this verse as the slave woman and then the slave. He uses Sarah's name, but he does not use Hagar's name, as if the status of women wasn't already low enough. If you're a slave woman, we're not even going to name you. And the only reason that anything is being done to consider if we should take care of them or not is because, well, Ishmael is also still a son of Abraham, and that son carries weight, even if he's not the correct son, Isaac. And they're exiled. They're wandering through the desert, and they almost die of dehydration, and an angel comes to protect them because, again, Ishmael is still needed and has importance as a son of Abraham. But this exiling is a huge deal that God prescribed, not that the Bible describes. And again, in this story, in looking at it at a greater length, we understand God's allowance of the situation, the slave woman, the rape, let's call it what it is, of her, using her body to do something that Sarah can't. And then the immediate disposal of her when she no longer serves the purpose except to keep Ishmael alive, but not as important as Isaac. So much for caring about family values, so much for not endorsing polygamy, so much for not endorsing rape, so much for, well, if a slave runs away, let him go. Nope, God sends an angel to retrieve them. And IP should understand this, that there is context that would allow us to understand what this God condemns and what he condones. And all of these horrific things that I have just listed off are either 100% obviously prescribed by this God, or they are allowed or condoned or working within the order that he already gave. Oh, quick side note, I did have the verse pulled up about Abraham lying in Egypt about Sarah being his wife. And was Abraham punished for lying, which is supposedly wrong? No. When they took Sarah into the court of Egypt, God sent plagues upon them. Why? They were just following the information that they had that was from the lie of Abraham. So not only did God not show his disapproval of the lie, even if he doesn't specifically prescribe it, but he curses not Abraham, but the Egyptians for being on the other side of the lie, which they had nothing to do with, and then blesses Abraham moving forward. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about. There's so much context that we can still understand what this God is okay with and what he's not. And it does not match up with the character of a perfectly just, loving, and truthful God. And like father, like son, Isaac lies about his wife Rebecca in the same fashion and is still blessed by God. So, issues everywhere. And these lies and deceptions seem contagious within the family because Rebecca then helps her son, Jacob, our second man we're going to point to here, deceive his father, Isaac. He wants the blessing that is not meant for him, that belongs to Esau. You know, the one God hated from birth. And if you want the full context here, you can look at Genesis 27:19 and also 28:13 through 15. But Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing. And then obviously, since that blessing did go on Jacob, it means what? That God's hands are tied to the misunderstanding of Isaac because of the deception of Jacob. He just has to give this blessing. No, God could have stepped in and say, sorry, your son's tricking you. The birthright belongs to Esau. Let me make this right. But instead, God does this. Later, God appeared to Jacob and says, I am the Lord, the God of your father, Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying, effectively receiving the birthright of Esau. So I ask you, is this a description of something going on in the Bible where man is faulty, or through God's allowance of the blessing to be utilized through Jacob that would then become Israel? All of God's plans for his chosen people had to go this way, including the prophecy that God made of when they were still in the womb and one would serve the other. And God hated Esau and loved Jacob. It seems like God was totally on board with all this lying and deceit and confusion, just to bring about his will. Also, one of the things that the person IP was responding to is bringing up is how women are objects, and I covered that within Abraham. But polygamy in general is something that is never specifically prescribed by God in the Bible, but it is an obvious necessary outcome for the other prophecies that God intends to fulfill, like the 12 tribes coming from Jacob. Well, Jacob had multiple wives to bring that to fruition, and many of our patriarchs had multiple wives, and we never once see any of this condemned by God. If marriage was really between one man and one woman, then maybe every single man that was, of course, just a product of their time and place and thus had multiple wives. If biblically wrong, though, we should have seen this condemned by God, not worked through by God. So something to point out while we are in Jacob, but let's continue to move down the line and go to Joseph for number 3. And by the way, before we do, I just want to show you why I think this kind of education is important and how IP is either just taking the ease of which we can make these kinds of statements and not choosing to look at the context or the times that God prescribes the bad. Because look at the comments from IP's video. Godly doesn't mean we are perfect. That's what a lot of people misunderstand. I love when they use Christian morality to try and vilify Christianity, laugh out loud. Anti-theist favorite terms, objects, property. We're not the ones that wrote that in the Bible. When God says you can own other people as property and we point that word out, that doesn't make it our favorite word. It makes it one of your God's commands. It's always fascinating to me when people say, well, look at the terrible things that your holy man did. Obviously, your God supports it, while also ignoring all of the punishments these men suffered as a result. It always fascinates me when people only look at the times God punished the bad behavior they don't like, instead of all the times that God prescribed it. Thus why I'm making this video. And I could go on forever, but lastly here, it's interesting that they can't tell the difference between the Bible describing versus commanding. If the Bible were fake, why would it plainly record the moral failings of its heroes? I hear this stuff all the time. I'm not the one that can't distinguish the difference between the Bible describing and commanding. Christians are the ones who only look at the Bible describing and not all of the horror that God commands. So let's help out in that endeavor. Let's get back on track. Number 3, Joseph. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. So the larger context here is there's this famine going on in Egypt, or about to. Joseph interprets the dream for the Pharaoh. He gets put in charge of preparations, and then obviously through purposeful scheming, takes the grain from the Egyptians only to sell it back to them at the point of starvation so that he can own all their property. These are incredibly dubious actions. And again, these Egyptians sold their land, their livestock, and then eventually even themselves just to stay alive. So where is God's prescription of all of this? The narrative obviously suggests that God's guidance was with Joseph as he made all of these plans and actions. He's the one that gave Joseph the abilities to find favor from the Pharaoh to be put in a position to do this. And we see it fulfill God's will, which of course is the only thing that matters in this might makes right divine command theory, because later Joseph is able to help establish his people with the better lands as these things are being redistributed and planned out. And you wonder why right after this, the Israelites find themselves in slavery back to Egypt. And the reason I bring up this specific example is because it is about God's chosen people versus God's non-chosen people, or Israelites and Gentiles, foreigners, however you want to say it. It's the same thing we saw with Hagar versus Sarah, with Isaac versus Ishmael. Who cares if what we're doing is wrong for other people? It's all about what side you're on. And the time that these men do get punished for their incorrect actions is when they are breaking God's law that affects God's plan for his chosen people. Once you start to see that so clearly, the story is not so beautiful. You can't just attach John 3:16, for God so loved the whole world, and say, look, God is always good, always just, all the time for everyone. No, he is not. He's extremely hypocritical and indecisive and inconsistent for when it suits him and his purposes and his people best. And even within his people, the ones that he favors, like Jacob over Esau, for whatever plan he wants to bring about. So yes, talking about the morally horrific behavior of these patriarchs, leading men of God, and understanding God's use of them and their bad behavior, not despite their bad behavior, is absolutely telling about the character of this God of the Bible. Let's move on to one where we're going to have to limit ourselves. Number 4, Moses. Moses did so many horrific things that God did not prescribe, like when he first kills the Egyptian taskmaster. Oh, Brandon, that was a good thing. Why was that a good thing? Well, because that man was treating his slave poorly. Oh. So murdering him was just? Because I hear this all the time when I bring up this kind of an example. Didn't I just give you a story about where Abraham and Sarah forcefully impregnated and then mistreated their slave? Did God kill them because it was just, or did he return the slave and tell her to submit further before exiling her so as not to cause problems for his chosen beloved Isaac? Do you see what I mean about it just depends which side of the fence you're on? So again, Moses did tons of stuff that was obviously bad that God just doesn't say boo about. But there's plenty of times where what Moses is doing that is bad is commanded from God. Let's talk about a few of those. How about all the plagues of Egypt? God commands it, and then God takes credit for it. Well, the Egyptians had it coming. Did they, or did Pharaoh? And did Pharaoh, or did God harden his heart so he could continue to do these things? See this video for more information. So even though Christians have justifications at the ready for why these things were okay, here is God commanding Moses to do obvious morally incorrect behavior like killing children, when we look at the last plague, that had nothing to do with this whatsoever, and God being the one who prescribed it. On the same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And then the instructions for the blood magic to protect his special people. That's not a description, that's a prescription. How about Moses killing the Midianites? Let me read to you from Numbers 31. I'd encourage you to go read verses 1 through 18. Here's 17. Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Here we specifically see the killing of young children, boys, women who had nothing to do with anything going on as long as they weren't useful because they weren't virgins, and then the capture, the taking the kidnapping of young virginal women. And I'm not talking about 19-year-olds that hadn't had sex yet. I'm talking about little girls. Take them for yourselves. Whatever do you think that was for? Well, Brandon, don't you know they actually married them? So, God made it right. Otherwise, what would have happened to these women, to these girls? God would have had to kill them, or they would have starved to death without the provision from all the men that were just genocided. So this is a grace. Now they're with the correct, righteous people group. You can call it whatever you want. This is genocide with a select preference for little girls, for full-grown Israelite soldiers to kidnap and rape. I don't care if you put a marriage certificate on it or not. And was this just Moses who commanded this and we described it? Or was this God's prescription to Moses for the people? Then my mind goes back to thinking about those comments from those self-righteous Christians on IP's video about how stupid we are for not being able to tell the difference between a command and a description. Are they just ignorant of verses like these? Are they so twisted up in following this God that they've made the moral compromise to try and justify what otherwise they would never, ever justify in any other case in all of history for any other God or culture? Or are they hypocrites who know this and don't care? Are they purposeful deceivers who don't want to bring this up? I don't know what the excuse is. I just know that it's inexcusable. Now, we're getting into the territory where we're going to cover a lot of genocides and murders that are going to include a lot of children and things like this. And let me just say for the record, I know the Christian arguments about these people were so evil, or these people worshipped a God that demanded child sacrifice, or these people were the Nephilim and so they had to be snuffed out because they were demon spawn. I don't care what level, again, of excuse you're trying to make. If the only thing that this all-powerful God could come up with was full genocide or complete destruction of women, children, livestock, and cities, despite the men, sure, wars had to happen. That's fine. But if you zoom out and you understand that most of the time these things happen because God caused the division in the first place, or God chose to have a chosen people in the first place, or God didn't reveal himself to these other people, so they were doing nothing but following their culture, or that these people that are doing these horrendous things are doing the exact kind of things that the Israelites are doing, under God's command, by the way, then all of those ridiculous justifications for killing children and women, they completely fail. So keep that in mind as I tell you some more of these. How about the Levite purge? So this is after the golden calf incident. We're going to get 3,000 people that are murdered here. I'll read to you from Exodus 32, 27 through 28. Then he, Moses, said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." Prescription. "Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. Yeah, but Brandon, they made a false idol. Okay. Moses worshipped false gods too when he was in Egypt for lack of understanding. God showed grace. God revealed himself to him. These people that didn't have a chance to do this as well, because God's presence was reserved early on for just special occasions with just special men, do we blame them for making the same mistakes? Isn't there a better way God could have dealt with this? But I get when you're a Christian and you hear these things, you're like, these people had it coming. How gross, how sad to think so little of your God, the most all-powerful, all-loving, all-forgiving, all just creator of the universe. What little expectation you must have for what that kind of being could and should actually be like. Of course, we can move on to verses like 20, 16 through 18. "However, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, as if there's not people and children and families living there already. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them." And then he lists a bunch: the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, "as the Lord your God has commanded you." Not descriptive. "Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do and worship their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God." This is interesting because most of the time, Christians like to try to justify this. They always go to Moloch, which was a god of only some of these people, that only some of the people actually did child sacrifice to. But God is clear here. He doesn't want intermingling. We see this all over the Old Testament. This is the reason for utterly destroying all of them, because his people who have supposedly seen his glory, who supposedly have the one and only God, would otherwise be so easily swayed to these incorrect ideas? Is God so insecure? This is the only thing he can think to do? What if he went and revealed himself to all of those tribes, made it clear that he's the only God? Then they could all intermingle because it wouldn't be an issue. Or maybe God doesn't have to send his chosen people into an inhabited land. They've been wandering around for 40 years. Why not snap Moses' fingers or raise his staff and have utopia pop up? Paradise in the desert, complete with fortified walls and everything. No bloodshed needed. And if you think that's asking too much because things need to happen naturally, trust me, in the destruction of all of those tribes, nothing was natural. God guided the hand. God did miracle after miracle to make sure that they got victory. This is beyond inexcusable. There's plenty more for Moses, and we're going to have to speed this up. Let's move on to Joshua. Same thing at the destruction of Jericho. Joshua 6:17 and 21. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she was willing to lie for the right side, because lies are totally okay when it helps God's cause. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle and sheep and donkeys. This is not hyperbole. We know it's not hyperbole because of the examples of when people don't follow this to the letter of the law, like when they left some boys alive and Moses had them all murdered, or when Saul left the king and some goats alive and then Saul lost his kingdom because he lost his favor from God for not following it to the letter of the law. Just really picture it. I know that we can't get ourselves to think about the innocent men that were in these cities, because men are always bad. They were all probably evil, demon worshiping, Israelite killing men. That's not true either. But the women, the little boys, and worst, the little girls, if I can try to tug on your heartstrings here, tell me why this all-powerful, perfect God would ever need to have these little girls either killed or become sex slaves. Why are those the only two options? Unless this God simply doesn't care about foreigners. I mean, that's it. From the own prescriptive details, not descriptive, we see God's heart. And it is not the pretty one that is described. We could go on for Joshua to talk about Ai's destruction or the southern campaigns, the northern king's defeat. There's so much horrendous murder, genocide, rape, all of these things that happened from Joshua as commanded or endorsed or condoned by God. But let's move on to our sixth example. Let's talk about David. Now, here's the funny thing. David does some terrible things. Of course, the affair with Bathsheba, and then having Bathsheba's husband murdered to cover it up. And you know what was awesome is we did have God say, this was wrong, you shouldn't have done this, and punish David. Oh, wait, he didn't punish David. Don't get me started. You guys know what happened. He kills David's son and then has David's multiple wives, which he was okay with, because when David confesses his sins to God, you know what he doesn't confess? I married multiple women. It's left out. God doesn't have a problem with it. But then he has all those wives raped in public, which is a good time for me to call time out and say, you know what? There's one other category we didn't talk about. You have bad things done by people in the Bible that is a description that is not okay by God. Then you have bad things done in the Bible where we don't see God condemn or condone it. And it's in this middle ground. But by context, we could usually see God's okay with it. Then we have these bad things done by men in the Bible where God commands it. But there's a fourth category here, when God does the bad things in the Bible. This is why it's so funny to even talk about these men at all. We have actually more examples of God being the one doing the obvious bad thing, not by my standard, not by my atheist lack of a standard, by God's own moral standard that he breaks in doing it, like killing this baby, or when he tells a lie, like in 1 Kings. I've done so many videos, guys. You know about all of this. But that biggest category is one we're not even going to get into. We'll just leave it out here. God does way more worse things than the most wicked men of the Bible. And so a lot of David's story is either God doing the wicked things, or it's that second category of the middle ground. An example would be like Saul, who doesn't want David to enter into the family, so he sends him on the mission to kill and mutilate 100 Philistines and bring back 100 foreskins to prove it. And David, we could say, was blessed by God to be able to commit this, but it's not clear. It's not a prescription. He goes and he doubles that number, 200 mutilations and murders, to which he gets his first wife, Michal, as a prize. Well, Brandon, you know, things were pretty weird and messed up back then. Yeah, for sure. But did God, this perfect God of, you know, not being stuck in time, ever say, wait, we don't need to do all this. Saul, just make David your son-in-law. If you take the Bible seriously, there was a moment when David was walking home with a bag full of 200 foreskins that he and his men stood over the dead corpses of to fillet. And this is the man after God's own heart. This is the man that God would use almost more than any other man up until Jesus. And yeah, it's not condoned, but it's not condemned. And I think that's something that needs to be completely understood. I can only give so many examples when God says, go do this. So much of what happens in the Bible is not condemned by God, and it's obviously horrific by these people that God is using to bring about his will. So we're going to move straight on to Elijah. So most people know the story from 1 Kings where Elijah organizes this competition, to test God, to prove that God is real. And so you have all the prophets of Baal try to get their God to light up the altar, and Elijah makes his harder. They pour water on it. Elijah tests God, and of course God shows up and delivers, and we see the correct God. Now that's great. We have proof of who the right God is. People can make the right decisions. But that's not where the story ends. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. Now, I'm breaking my own rule. I am showing one of those middle grounds because this isn't from God. But if you understand the context of this story and how much Elijah was blessed by God, essentially had access to God's checkbook to write whatever check he needed to write, and God just continuing to show up and do the things that Elijah was calling for, like sending down this fire, I think is an obvious example of God condoning the behavior. But I understand if this is the one you want to argue back with me about in the comments. But let's move on to Elisha. This one's going to be easy. How about the 42 children that were killed by she-bears for making fun of Elisha? And we can see this as a prescription if we just read 2 Kings 2:23 through 24. From there, Elisha went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. Get out of here, Baldy, they said. Get out of here, Baldy. He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. So a curse in whose name? The Lord. Now, if this was a curse God didn't want to happen, nothing would happen. But what happened? Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. I'm bald. In a billion years, I would never want 42 of even the most mature men alive mauled by 2 bears on my behalf of that. But Elisha, a great man of God, did, and God apparently also did, by blessing the curse. We're moving quickly now. Samson, how about killing the 30 Philistines to pay his bet? From Judges 14:19. Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. This wasn't a gift that God had given Samson one time that Samson's been abusing. Every time that we see Samson do this, the Spirit of the Lord has to first come upon him. Another example of this is when he kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, or when he pulls down the temple. Judges 16:23 through 31, then Samson prayed to the Lord, Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. He had to pray before he did this thing that killed himself and others. For what? Revenge, not for God's glory. Tell me these horrific acts by Samson, killing thousands of people for his own revenge and owed debts, where we see the Spirit of the Lord assist, is not a prescription from God. And let's end with one where I'm already sad I included it because I'm really not looking forward to hearing the excuses. Jephthah. Jephthah's vow to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house if God will help him win a military battle, which, by the way, is the exact reason that many of the evil people of other tribes were killing their children for favor from the gods. Here's what Yahweh didn't do. He didn't say, we don't play those games here. No, don't make that vow. I'll punish you for making that vow, and I won't accept the vow. He accepts the vow. He helps win the battle for them. And then we get no description of him intervening like he does with Abraham, where he says, okay, nope, just wanted to test you here. And we see that Jephthah goes through with the sacrifice. Again, you might say it's in that second category, that middle ground, but to me, I see a whole lot of God accepting, helping, and then allowing. So what's the point of talking about these 10 men who, yes, were not all morally superior, which is totally fine. It's to show that this straw man version of God used weak and bad people to do good and righteous things is incorrect and fallacious. It is a misdirection from what we actually see happening in the Old Testament with these men. And if you're going to blow all this off to talk about, well, that was Old Testament, what's your point? When Jesus says, I and the Father are one, when Jesus says, I am here to uphold the law and the prophets, the prophets that did these kinds of things, the law that endorsed it, the Father who prescribed it. What point do you think you're trying to make? Trust me, I get it. It sucks to think of this God that you think loves you and has a personal plan for you and is your best friend and savior is just another man-made creation of their time and place. I've been there. I went through it. I was in denial too. I made all the same dumb excuses that now drive me absolutely insane. But what other conclusions are there to draw if we're honest? How many times is IP going to be able to repeat that line? While I'm sure he knows about all the verses I just listed and more. Tons more verses than this. Hundreds more of that second category, and even larger of God doing the bad deeds himself. And yet we just get the same sad strawman over and over and over. Enough. It's all right here. I didn't write the book. I'm not taking anything out of context. It is what it is, and what it is either evil or false. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for being here. I'll see you Thursday for Acts, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast and Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, James, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people today.